Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a trip back in time. We're currently on the ground at Naval Air Station Midway, the year is 1942, and we're going to be taking a look at the recently released Aeroplane Heaven Grumman F3-F. This video will not be a full review, we're going to take the aircraft on a lap around the island, we'll take in some of the scenery, and of course we'll discuss the product a bit as we go. This historically accurate rendition of Midway is a piece of freeware scenery that I found on flightsim.to. Really excellent, well worth checking out. And a big thank you to Johnny Propeller for the upload. So the plan for our flight today, we'll get the aircraft started up, we'll head off the westerly runway here at Midway. We'll fly a little bit of a figure of 8 around the island, we'll pull some manoeuvres as well as we go. And as I say, we'll just discuss the product in real time as we carry out the flight. And once we've completed our lap around the island, we'll come back for a landing and get the aircraft shut down. As always guys, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comments section below. Let's now head for the cockpit of the Flying Barrel. You can certainly see where that nickname came from. And we'll get the aircraft started up. So here we are in the cockpit of the Grumman F3-F. As I say, we'll talk about the aircraft as we go, but overall I actually really like the cockpit of the Grumman. I think Aeroplane Heaven have done a very nice job with it. I would say the modelling is up to their usual standards. I think the texturing is actually slightly nicer than some of their previous efforts in the sim, so that's great to see. There are still a few areas that could use a little bit of work. For example, if I come straight back on my stick, you can see the joystick in the aircraft is animated back and to the right. And the same is true if I go fully forward, so there are still a few areas that need cleaning up, but overall again I really like the cockpit. As usual, run through the before start checks. So the park brake is set, we do have good pressure there on the brake gauge. The gear switch is selected down and we do have the pin installed. We'll come on to the main fuel tank for the start. Prop RPM is set to low. Mixture will come up to around 50%. Now I'm just cracking the throttle. Battery switch can come on. The click spot for the battery and the generator switch is slightly out of position at the moment. Fuel quantity. We have 50% of our fuel capacity on board. That's going to be plenty for our quick run around the island today. And it's a cold start. It's a fairly warm day outside, so we'll just go for 3 pumps on the primer. Mags can go on to both. And just checking that the prop area is clear. Which it is. Clear prop. I'm going to engage the starter. It does take a little bit of time for the engine to catch, which is really great. That obviously goes to show that Aeroplane Heaven have gone to some effort of modelling the engine start a little bit more accurately. And we do have a good start. You can see some nice smoke effects there as well. We'll cage up the starter once again. Oil pressure light has gone out. We'll just come up slightly on the throttle. Just check we're seeing a registry there on the manifold pressure gauge. And we'll come all the way back to idle. We'll let the engine warm up. We'll lock the primer. And the generator switch can go on. Generator warning lights out. And we've got a good reading there on the ammeter. Just before we taxi, once again checking we have the gear switch selected down with the pin installed. Gear is indicating down. Tail hook is selected up. And we'll unlock the tail wheel ready for the taxi. On the rudder, we're actually going to leave that in neutral. The manual does call for a little bit of rudder trim during the takeoff, but I find it's not really necessary. And we'll come back slightly on the elevator trim. We'll go for about 0.5 units up. So we are now ready for the taxi. We'll come fully back on the stick. The park brake can come off. You can see there's a pretty stiff wind here on the ground today, so we'll be going for runway 25. So we'll just carefully make our way out through the flight line towards the runway. Fairly tight spacing here, so we'll take it nice and slow. Keep a good eye on our wingtip clearance as we go. We'll get out to the right. And get out to the left as well. Nice short taxi for us. The runway's almost straight off the nose. And we'll just hold a beam the runway. We'll carry out the last of our checks before we go. It's a fleet of B-24s just off the left wing. And we're clear on the right. So we're just holding our present position. Gently onto the brakes. We don't want to tip the nose, of course. Back on the park brake. And we'll come up to around 1000 RPM now. The engine should have warmed up a little bit more. So takeoff checks will come up to max RPM on the prop. Mixture can go to fully rich. You can see we have a fuel-air ratio gauge there, which is something I've never seen before. That's quite interesting. Quite a nice little feature on the aircraft, we'll talk more about that later on perhaps. Anyway, the mixture is set rich, and just the tail wheel to come, we'll lock that once we're on the runway. And just checking, we are all clear on final, so once again the park brake can come off. And we'll get ourselves lined up runway 25. The wind's almost straight down the runway, so that should make a fairly easy takeoff for us overall. Okay, so we're pretty much all set. Obviously it's quite an intersection that we've taken from the apron here. We've still got plenty of runway 25 behind us, which is never really great practice, but we've got a pretty stonking headwind of course, and apparently the F3-F can get off the ground in as little as 190 feet, so I thought it'd be quite interesting to put that to the test. Anyway, last thing we'll do, we'll just lock up the tail wheel for the takeoff. We'll come off the parking brake, just holding the aircraft on the brakes momentarily. And we'll start feeding in the throttle. I think with that headwind we should get the aircraft off the ground in very short order. You can see the tail already wanting to lift there. Just continuing to feed in the throttle. Coming back on the stick just to keep the nose off the ground. And we're up. So you can see for yourselves, the F3-F certainly almost stole-like in its capabilities. You can really get the aircraft off the ground very shortly. Anyway, back to 30 inches on the manifold pressure for the climb. We'll come back to 2500 on the RPM. And we'll just continue to climb away for now. Waiting until we're up through 300 feet, which we now are, so we'll take the gear up. A little bit of a juggling act here. You do actually have to switch hands to actuate the gear, which is true to life of the real-world aircraft. Now bringing the landing gear up, and we're now showing indicated up on the gear selector. So we'll just continue to climb away at 30 inches manifold pressure, 2500 RPM. As I say, we'll just make a lap around the island of Midway. Looks like we've got a bit of a boat down there in the water. Just out at our 1 o'clock we've got the seaplane portion of the island. A few Catalinas down in the water there. You can see there's a bit of a ground base as well, off on the western edge of the island. And it looks like we've got a few warships parked up there as well. I think we'll leave the canopy open for the flight. We might as well just have the slightly more panoramic view that having the canopy open offers. We won't climb too high, we'll stay nice and low to appreciate the scenery, so we'll come back now, go for around 22 inches on the manifold pressure and around 2300 RPM. For it being a biplane, the F3-F actually cruises along quite nicely. You can easily, quite happily get the aircraft cruising along around 180 miles an hour, so quite speedy. We'll pull a few more manoeuvres later on just to see how acrobatic or not the aircraft actually is. And we'll just head out for the most westerly edge of the island. As I say, we'll do one full lap, we'll carry out a few manoeuvres and then we'll come back for the landing. One nice feature of the aircraft, it does have some fairly limited navigational capabilities. If we click down on the nav radio, we can actually bring up both an ADF and a basic VOR indicator there. Really we just have the RMI needles, but nice to have. It does mean that you can potentially do some quite decent cross-country legs with a bit of navigation thrown in, which was my original intent for this flight, but I thought it'd be nice to do a slightly more period accurate flight around Midway, given that the scenery is pretty excellent. So with 22 inches manifold pressure, 2300 RPM, maintaining straight level, we're doing 180 miles an hour, so as I said, the aircraft quite speedy, particularly for a biplane. And out now at the most westerly tip of the island, just off the reef. You can see for yourselves, the island mostly made up of reefs really. Just got the two slightly larger land masses, both of which have been developed on. Overall the aircraft's quite pleasant to hand fly, it's very stable. Once you've trimmed it out it sits pretty nicely at altitude. Same goes in roll, which you'd generally expect from a biplane of course. Now we've got some beautiful white sandy beaches just off the westerly edge of the western island. Baijian tree mod as well, doing quite a nice job there. It is slightly more wintry even in this part of the world at the moment. And again we've got the airfield just off the nose. We're not going to head back just yet. We'll do a little bit of a figure eight and we'll track up towards the north. We'll carry out our manoeuvres out towards the north as well, I think. So we'll just come up again on the RPM. You may have noticed on the departure we actually oversped the engine according to the red line there on the RPM gauge. I'm not sure whether or not that's accurate to the real world aircraft, but I would assume we take off at full RPM. Anyway, we'll come back up to 2500 and 30 inches on the manifold pressure. We'll just put the aircraft into a little bit of climb, gain a little bit more altitude before we carry out our manoeuvres. As I mentioned during the start and the taxi out, we have that fuel air ratio gauge. I think that's quite a nice feature. Basically we can just use that to adjust the mixture setting on the aircraft according to Aeroplane Heaven. Generally having the needle in the middle of the gauge there means you've got a fairly optimal fuel to air ratio, but we'll leave that up at fully rich for now. We're not really planning on going any higher than 3,000 feet, especially with the cloud base as it is. We'll just turn away from the cloud here. Try and keep clear of the clouds as we carry out our manoeuvres. So up through 3,000 feet, that should give us enough clearance. We'll carry out, I think we'll go for a loop first. So we'll pitch the nose down, we'll build up some speed. Looks like our VNE is around 250 miles an hour. And there's 250, coming back on the stick. Aircraft feels pretty good on the controls. It feels quite heavy, but again, you'd probably expect that from an aircraft of this period. With it being a biplane, it should be fairly manoeuvrable. Almost fully back on the stick now, just coming over the top of the loop. Keep the power on, we'll go straight into a stall. Just before we carry out that stall, actually, we'll again make sure we're clear of the clouds. A little bit of a hold down below us, that should do for the time being. So we'll try a power on stall just to give us a bit more altitude. Speed bleeding off, just coming back through 60 miles an hour. There's 40, so the aircraft has a very low stall speed, but again, you'd probably expect that from a biplane. A little bit of rattling and shaking, that's courtesy of FS Realistic. And the aircraft ever so slightly dropping the right wing, the nose mushing down there, not really going into a spin. Coming back on the controls some more, feeding a little bit of left aileron there and actually inducing a spin out to the right now. Cut the throttle, releasing the controls. Yeah, so overall the stall behaviour, not the best that I've seen in the sim, but reasonably nice overall. I'm just trying to avoid overspeeding that prop once again. Interestingly, the prop now wanting to overspeed a lot more readily than it was a minute ago. But just coming back slightly on the prop lever. Come back up to our 30 inches. Fuel state still looking good there. We haven't really burned through much of our fuel at all. And we'll try an aileron roll, so we'll go full deflection out to the right. Overall, the roll rate of the aircraft is very low. I don't know how realistic or not that is to the F3-F. We do only have the one set of ailerons on the upper wing, so it's fairly plausible, I would say. And lastly, we'll just go fully back on the stick there. We'll try a full rate turn out to the left. Speed's starting to bleed back as we do that. We'll just keep doing that. We'll see what the aircraft does. Looks like overall we're pretty much just going to sit here around 110 miles an hour. Speed is still slowly coming back. And that looks about it. That's all we're going to get out of the aircraft, which again is fairly typical of Microsoft Flight Simulator. It seems quite a few aircraft don't really stall there if you just put a lot of load onto the aircraft. Anyway, we'll head out towards the northern edge of the island and then we'll follow the reef again back in for a landing back onto runway 25. So once again coming back on the power and back on the prop. We'll get our downwind checks out of the way, so the brakes are checked and off. Undercarriage we will hold for now. Mixture is rich, fuel pump we don't have, fuel quantity is checked. Instruments are checked, landing light not required. Harness is secure, we'll leave the canopy open. We don't have any flaps in the Grumman either, so we do have to manage the approach a little bit more carefully than usual, although we do have the gear of course to slightly help us if we find ourselves a little bit high and fast. But overall I found the aircraft pretty easy to manage on the approach. And again, quite enjoyable to fly. I will say that it's not the most immersive flight model I've come across in an aircraft. It feels somewhat simplistic overall, but it feels like it's doing a relatively good job of modelling the type of aircraft it's looking to model. I think for me the biggest letdown really with the aircraft is the sounds. They're not bad, but they're really lacking some bass. They're quite tinny overall. And I know that Aeroplane Heaven have been criticised in the past for the sounds of their aircraft being too loud, and probably rightfully so. I think they've gone just a little bit too far the other way, but credit where credit's due. At least they've obviously taken that feedback on board and tried to adjust things accordingly. But I would say that the sounds just need bumping up again ever so slightly, and a little bit more bass, as I say. So the field's just off at our 1 o'clock. Once we're below 150 miles an hour, we'll take the gear and just trim the aircraft as the speed bleeds off. So looking good there now on the speed. Once again we'll have to remove the safety pin, put the gear selector down, and we'll crank the gear down. We have a gear down indication, and we have a green light there on the gear indicator. We'll maintain around 90 miles an hour for now. We want to be between around 75 and 85 over the threshold. And again we'll just follow the reef back towards the field, which is just off at our 1 o'clock. Get our final checks out of the way, so pitch can go back to full fine. Undercarriage is down. Flaps we don't have on board the aircraft. Landing clearance is not required, and we'll check the runway is clear once we come on to final. Yeah, so once again I quite enjoy flying the F3-F. I think that the aircraft, of course it's far from study level, it's a reasonably simplistic flight model. It doesn't do anything, doesn't do anything revolutionary in the sim. But it's a reasonably fun, pleasant little aircraft to fly, and again, I just like the character of the aircraft overall. You can see the flight line again, just off at our 2 o'clock. Runway 25's just out to the south of that, so we'll continue round. We're on a little bit of a right hand at the moment for runway 25. We'll start coming back on the throttle, let that speed start bleeding back. Again with that headwind, plenty of runway as well. I have no doubt that we're going to be able to land pretty easily. I think we'll almost be hovering onto the runway today. Looks as though the runway is clear, and again we don't need any clearance for the landing. Touch fast here still, so just letting that speed slowly fall back. Again aiming to be over the threshold around 85 miles an hour. Visibility out the front as well is fairly reasonable, but making a little bit of a curved approach here just to help. Looks as though the runway is actually slightly narrower for the first portion, so we'll just stay slightly out to the right, the centre line. Looking good there on the speed. Keep the power on for now. You can see we're travelling pretty slowly over the ground there with that headwind. And just holding the aircraft off. We'll come back on the throttle. Again, incredibly slowly over the ground. We really are almost hovering onto the deck. There's touchdown. I think we flared just a little bit high there. And we'll just roll through back towards the parking area. So again, overall not too bad of a landing. I think we did flare the aircraft a little bit high. We'll unlock the tail wheel, we'll reset the trim back to neutral. And just checking it's all clear on the other runway, so we'll head back towards the apron. Looks like there's a spare parking spot just between the third and the fourth aircraft there on the front row, so we'll go for that. And again, it's pretty tight here on the apron, so we'll take it nice and slow for the taxi. Looks like we've got just enough room to thread our little Grumman between the other parked aircraft. Keeping a really good eye on our wingtip clearance. There's a ground vehicle out there as well, so that's going to make the gap even tighter. So we're all clear of the ground vehicle. And just about clearing the tail of the aircraft there on our left. And here's our spot just on the left. Let's come in gently onto the brakes. Park brake can go on. And we'll come back on the throttle. Again, we'll let the engine idle around 1000 RPM until we shut down. The shutdown checks the tail wheel. We'll put that back to lock now that we're parked up. The tail wheel should be straight. Trims are set to neutral. Throttle can come back to idle. Prop RPM can go to low. And we'll go to idle cutoff on the mixture. So we do have a good shutdown. The max can go off. Generator can come off. Get the fuel selector off once again. And lastly, we'll get the battery off. And that's the shutdown checklist complete. So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed our flight in the Aeroplane Heaven Grumman F3-F and our little historic tour around US Naval Air Station Midway. As I said, this video is not really intended to be a full review, but I quite like the look of the Grumman F3-F, so I thought we'd give it a go. I think we've broadly discussed the aircraft throughout the flight, but just to touch on a few things once again. Overall, I personally quite like the aircraft. Again, I think it's quirky, I think it's good fun, it's something a little bit different. As usual with Aeroplane Heaven, the product comes with a fairly painstakingly recreated external model. And again, as we discussed earlier, I would say that the internals of the aircraft are also done very nicely, probably a slight cut above some of their previous efforts in the sim. The sounds of the aircraft could definitely use a little bit of work. Externally, I think they're quite nice. Internally, as far as the cockpit sounds themselves go, most of the controls and switches there seem to have associated sounds and were quite decent. It's really just the internal engine sounds letting the aircraft down a bit currently. Again, I think the internal engine sounds need the volume bumping up a little bit more bass as well, and overall just a little bit more oomph to them. The flight model, nothing to write home about as we've discussed, but overall the F3-F is a very pleasant aircraft to fly. It's very stable, particularly in the cruise. The aircraft's flight model does feel a touch sterile in terms of feedback, but overall it feels quite representative of a short, stubby, powerful little biplane. So the Grumman F3-F may not be to everybody's taste, but for me, as I say, I think it's quite a fun, interesting little aircraft. I'm sure we'll fly it on the channel again at some point. I think it'd be good fun to take on a bit of a cross-country hop. For today though, that's the end of our outing in the Aeroplane Heaven Grumman F3-F. As always, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider giving it a like. If you'd like to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. As always, if you have any comments or questions for me, please leave those down in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. A huge thank you once again to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. Very much appreciated. I hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.